Burkina Faso just disarmed 8,000 soldiers and sent them to farms instead of the front lines. No guns, no battles, just seeds, soil, and a radical new mission. Why would a country facing insurgency turn its defenders into farmers? Let's find out. On a quiet morning in July 2025, the government of Burkina Faso issued a statement that few could believe, and even fewer fully understood. It wasn't about a ceasefire or a new military alliance. It wasn't even about a policy debate or a cabinet reshuffle. It was something far more jarring. President Ibrahim Traoré had officially converted 8,000 trained volunteer fighters into full-time agricultural workers. No ceremonial send-off, no dramatic farewell, just a stark message. The war has shifted. The battlefield is now the farm. This was not a leak or a rumor. It came straight from the presidential office and was broadcast on state television. The declaration was clear, almost blunt. These were not demobilized soldiers. They were redeployed. The language made it unmistakable. Agricultural commandos, deployment zones, national food front. In other words, these young men and women were no longer just fighters. They were now frontline defenders in the war against hunger. At first, many assumed it was a temporary measure, perhaps a civilian work program disguised as reform. But then came footage that erased any doubt. Thousands of men in military trousers, carrying farming tools across villages, planting fields under the national flag. Uniformed, organized, intentional. Then came the second bombshell. The first group, 2,000 strong, had already completed a secretive 3-month agricultural training camp. Not only had they learned modern farming techniques, but they had also been drilled in community health, tree planting, land reclamation, and irrigation system design. One clip showed former fighters erecting greenhouses in drought-hit provinces. Another showed them digging wells in regions where aid convoys had long stopped arriving. And then, a voiceover from a government broadcaster delivered the message that sent analysts into a frenzy. These young Burkinabe are not leaving the defense force. They are expanding it, into the soil, into the food chain, into the future. Within hours, international media tried to catch up. Some framed it as a clever redirection of idle youth. Others called it a response to budget shortfalls. But insiders and local observers saw something deeper, a structural shift in national priorities. It wasn't just about food, it was about redefining the very meaning of defense, sovereignty, and service. And as the dust settled, more announcements followed. Traoré's government revealed that these 8,000 were just the beginning. A broader plan was underway to mobilize tens of thousands more young people, prison inmates, and even retired officers into strategic agricultural units. Former battlegrounds would be repurposed as green zones. Military vehicles were already being repainted and retrofitted for seed transport and irrigation work. Maps of deployment zones started circulating online, not for combat operations, but for mass cultivation corridors. Provinces long abandoned by both aid organizations and private investors were being marked with colored overlays. Maize here, cassava there, rice paddies along floodplains, and reforestation in degraded belts. But it didn't stop at domestic policy. The message to the world was subtle but undeniable. Burkina Faso was done begging for grain. It was done waiting for relief shipments. It was done by surrendering its youth to war and its future to aid dependency. Even more stunning was how calm the president appeared. He didn't declare a state of emergency. He didn't summon applause. He simply called it logical. Logical to feed one's people. Logical to train fighters to grow food instead of guarding empty shelves. Across African capitals, whispers began. Could this model work elsewhere? Was Burkina Faso simply desperate or dangerously ahead of its time? In neighboring Niger, a youth leader tweeted, "If Traoré turns the army into farmers and they end hunger, it won't be a policy, it'll be prophecy." This breaking news did more than announce a program. It challenged an entire framework. What if military power wasn't in weaponry, but in wheat? What if the next revolution didn't wear camo but carried compost? And what if Burkina Faso had just lit the first match? Let's pause for a second to say a big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, You're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. The Volunteers for the Defense of the Homeland VDPs didn't begin as a traditional army. They weren't state soldiers with pensions and long careers. They were a grassroots answer to a country buckling under the weight of chaos. In villages that had no police presence, no food banks, and no certainty of tomorrow, the VDPs were young men and women who said, "We'll defend this land even if no one else will." They were farmers' sons, traders' daughters, school dropouts, shepherds, mechanics, and even ex-child laborers. Many had never left their province before being handed a gun and a uniform. What united them wasn't training or ideology. It was desperation and duty. When Burkina Faso found itself overrun by armed groups, insurgent factions, and foreign-backed militias, the government had neither the resources nor time to build a large formal army. So it turned to its youth. In 2020, the VDPs were formed as a civilian auxiliary force, volunteers, not conscripts, who would defend their communities with light weapons, local intelligence, and minimal oversight. For years, they held the line where the state could not, but the cost was brutal. Thousands of VDPs died. Others were wounded and left without compensation. Still, more were caught in political crossfire, accused by some of being untrained militias, praised by others as local heroes. Their image remained raw, complex, and heavily dependent on which part of the country they were in. But to President Ibrahim Traoré, they represented something else entirely: untapped potential. When Traoré came to power in 2022, with a sharp anti-colonial vision and a belief in grassroots governance, he didn't see the VDPs as disposable wartime tools. He saw them as the nucleus of a new state philosophy: young, loyal, deeply embedded in local communities, and already accustomed to sacrifice. By the way, we have launched merch that honors the African leaders who are taking a stand for Africa. Check them out, to show you also stand with loyal sons of Africa, no matter where you are. That's why, when hunger surged to the top of the national threat list in 2025, Traoré didn't look to foreign NGOs, technocrats, or imported specialists. He looked at the VDPs and saw not just fighters, but builders. They already knew discipline. They already had a command structure. They had nothing to lose and everything to gain. But it wasn't just strategic. It was deeply psychological. These were youths who had been taught to defend land with bullets. Now, they were being asked to nurture it with water and care. That shift is more than professional, it's existential. For a country that had seen so much blood spill on its soil, asking its defenders to now feed that same soil was a healing act. Not symbolic, structural. The decision to retrain them wasn't a rebranding. It was a redefinition. In special training camps, they were stripped of their wartime mindset and slowly introduced to something far more challenging: patience. Farming doesn't give you victory in a day. It takes weeks, months, and trust in a process you can't fully control. And for fighters used to split-second survival, that mental rewiring was no small task. Yet they adapted, many faster than expected. Because buried under the fatigue and trauma was a deeper instinct, the desire to protect life, not just preserve it. And their communities noticed. Villagers who once only saw them in combat gear now watched them lead irrigation efforts, distribute seedlings, and host workshops on soil care. Children once taught to run when the VDPs approached were now running toward them to help plant trees. The state didn't just assign them new roles, it gave them new meaning. For the first time, many of these young volunteers weren't just surviving, they were building legacies. A harvest meant more than rations. A rice paddy meant more than a checkpoint. They were no longer temporary defenders. They were permanent architects of the nation's survival. And perhaps most importantly, they still wore their uniforms. In Traoré's Burkina Faso, the uniform no longer means war, it means work. But why was this even a need? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. There's a quiet war President Ibrahim Traoré is fighting, and it's not with rifles or tanks, it's with memory. The memory of waiting, of watching trucks from foreign agencies roll into starving villages, dumping plastic bags of rice onto dusty tarps, of being told again and again that Burkina Faso could not survive without help. That narrative of powerlessness was drilled into generations. Every drought meant donations. Every failed harvest meant more assistance. In boardrooms far from Ouagadougou, donors held the lifeline and pulled it tighter with every grant. Traoré has chosen to cut that rope. This isn't just an agricultural program. It's economic defiance. Every seed planted by a former soldier is a rejection of the belief that Burkina Faso must always beg to eat. And that rejection is deliberate, calculated, strategic. Why now? Because the aid system, in Traoré's eyes, is not neutral. It's a soft form of control, one that never carries weapons but always leaves nations disarmed. It arrives with logos, slogans, and conditions. Food, yes, but also influence. Relief, yes, but also strings. He saw it during negotiations. He saw it in emergency meetings. Every time Burkina Faso needed food, it had to offer something in return: political alignment, security cooperation, or silence. So when Traoré turned his defense volunteers into farmers, he wasn't just feeding the people, he was arming the country with independence, and it's working. Pilot zones under the new farming initiative are already showing results that used to require external intervention. Regions that were once entirely reliant on the World Food Program are now producing enough to sell to neighboring villages. In some areas, VDP-led irrigation projects have doubled planting seasons. State-run seed banks are being replenished, not by imports, but by domestic overproduction. And what's more, this strategy is exponentially scalable. Foreign aid works on a per-crisis model. A bad harvest means a new request, a new donor negotiation. However, local production creates circular strength. One good season doesn't just feed families, it generates seed stock for the next. It builds trust in local systems. It revives markets. It restores dignity. Traoré has tapped into something deeper than policy. He's changing the national psychology. For decades, Burkinabe citizens were taught to expect famine, to normalize drought, and to assume suffering. Aid became part of the identity. But now, when people see the same young men who once held rifles managing greenhouses or leading harvests, the story changes. The fear shifts from "who will save us" to "what can we grow ourselves?" This mental pivot is not incidental. It's engineered. Traoré has coupled the agricultural deployment with national messaging campaigns. Billboards in major cities now show former VDPs standing in fields with the slogan, "Our food, our freedom." School textbooks are being rewritten to include chapters on food sovereignty. National TV broadcasts farming techniques during primetime slots. Every message, every image is driving the same point home. Aid is not salvation. Self-reliance is. International observers are split. Some hail the initiative as a model for African resilience. Others warn that rejecting aid could risk humanitarian gaps. But Traoré seems unfazed. He's not betting on utopia, he's betting on systemic shift. This isn't a sprint, it's a controlled reprogramming of the entire country's survival instincts. And it's not just about feeding people, it's about reasserting control over the two things colonizers always targeted first: land and labor. With both now working together, under Burkinabe command, the balance of power is shifting, subtly, steadily, and without apology. So when Burkina Faso refuses a rice shipment or declines a food grant, it's not a mistake. It's a message. We remember what it felt like to wait for help that came too late. We're done waiting. But what happens next? When President Ibrahim Traoré ordered thousands of young fighters to trade their rifles for rakes, many assumed their impact would be limited to the farm. Plant a few crops, maybe help with harvests, and disappear back into rural obscurity. But that's not what happened. Because these weren't just idle hands. They were trained, tested, and mission-oriented. So when they arrived in remote villages, not as warriors, but as workers, they didn't stop at farming. They started rebuilding everything. In the village of Dedougou, locals now speak of the Green Brigade, a group of retrained VDPs who didn't just cultivate vegetables, but repaired 2 broken bridges, cleared out an abandoned irrigation canal, and built solar-powered water pumps for nearby farms. None of this was officially mandated. It wasn't a top-down directive. It was an initiative, the natural extension of discipline redirected toward productivity. What began as an agricultural deployment has evolved into something more ambitious, a rural reconstruction wave. In the East, Fighters arriving to revive fallow land discovered that the only road linking their assigned fields to the nearest market was unusable. With no state engineers nearby and no NGOs in sight, they borrowed construction manuals, recruited local laborers, and rebuilt the road themselves using laterite, gravel, and manpower. Within 3 weeks, produce from their harvest began flowing into market stalls that hadn't seen fresh crops in months. Elsewhere, in the north, former fighters found themselves in a village where the local school had been abandoned due to insecurity and neglect. After restoring the fields, they turned their tools toward the school, re-roofing classrooms, repainting walls, and even helping recruit volunteer teachers from among their ranks. These weren't isolated events. They were symptoms of something bigger. Traoré's experiment had inadvertently created an army of multi-skilled development agents, not just growers of food, but catalysts of community revival. They brought with them not only tools and training, but a sense of order and mission in places long forgotten by central governance. In many of these areas, the state had become a distant rumor. Clinics were empty, roads were dust, markets were silent. And then came a group of young men in boots and uniforms, not to extract, not to control, but to repair. The social shift has been just as powerful as the physical one. In zones traumatized by violence, where suspicion, ethnic division, and fear had taken root, the arrival of former fighters with no weapons and open hands was a shock. Villagers who had once fled at the sound of boots now offered food and assistance. Dialogue reopened, trust cautiously returned. And as the farming work grew, so did networks of local cooperation. One community chief in the Center-Nord region called it the quietest peace process we've ever seen. No negotiations, no mediators, just youth planting together instead of dying together. And here's what's most surprising. The transformation wasn't one-sided. These VDPs, many of whom had never received praise outside of combat, began to rediscover a kind of dignity they hadn't known in years. They weren't just alive, they were useful, respected, asked for advice. One former fighter who led a construction project told local radio, "When I was armed, people feared me. Now they call me when their children are sick or when a bridge collapses. It feels better." That shift, from feared to trusted, is arguably the most powerful element of this national transformation. Because rebuilding a broken country isn't just about roads and wells. It's about healing the fracture between people and their idea of government. And nothing heals that faster than a uniform that builds instead of breaks. Traoré didn't just redirect his soldiers, he unlocked something buried beneath their trauma, the will to protect through creation, not destruction. And as these young men and women keep moving from region to region, field to field, village to village, they're carrying something even more important than seeds or tools. Proof. Proof that a different kind of service is possible. That a post-conflict nation doesn't have to depend on outsiders. The most powerful kind of restoration is the one that comes from within. What began as a domestic pivot is now spreading like a signal fire across African borders. In capitals from Bamako to Kampala, murmurs are turning into debates. In universities, policy briefings, and youth forums, one question is surfacing with urgency. What if the future of African power doesn't lie in military might or donor deals, but in the land itself? President Ibrahim Traoré's agricultural redeployment wasn't broadcast as a grand Pan-African doctrine. There was no flashy speech to the African Union, no call for an economic summit. But that's exactly what makes it so disruptive. While politicians posture and institutions delay, Burkina Faso is already doing what most countries only theorize. It is, in many ways, a silent revolution. No loud declarations. Just fields being cultivated where there were once trenches. Just young people, long dismissed as victims of poverty or tools of war, now commanding the respect of elders in their villages, because they brought food, not fear. And other nations are noticing. In Niger, a proposal has been floated to retrain auxiliary security forces into dry season farmers. In Guinea, early reports suggest conversations within the Defense Ministry about reallocating logistics units to national food storage and distribution. Even Senegal, a nation historically more integrated with Western aid channels, has begun reviewing case studies of Traoré's model in internal memos. What makes this moment unique is that Africa is not watching from below. it's watching eye to eye. For once, the admiration is not directed at Europe, the UN, or China's massive infrastructure projects. It's directed at a fellow African nation with limited resources but unlimited resolve. This challenges long-standing assumptions embedded deep within post-colonial governance. That development must be imported, that progress needs permission, and that the only path forward lies in treaties, debt packages, and overseas training. Burkina Faso has disrupted that logic, and not through rebellion or isolation, but through practical, measurable, replicable outcomes. That's what scares the establishment and excites the restless. For decades, African youth have been told to wait. Wait for jobs, wait for peace, wait for investment. But in this new model, they're not being asked to wait. They're being asked to build, to plant, to lead, and most importantly, to stay. One of the most striking early effects of Traoré's initiative is the decline in migration intentions among participating youth. In surveys conducted in newly cultivated zones, a significant percentage of VDP-turned farmers expressed no desire to leave the country, citing pride in their work, ownership of land, and connection to the community. This flies in the face of a long-standing narrative that Africa's best must leave to succeed. Instead, it suggests a profound truth. People don't flee their homelands when they're given a reason to believe in them. And what if this becomes contagious? What happens when other nations realize that aid dependency is a design, not a destiny? That every rice import delays sovereignty? That every unemployed youth waiting for foreign investment could instead be cultivating national strength? Traoré didn't just create a new farming corps. He flipped a colonial legacy on its head. Where colonial powers once exploited African land for export, Burkina Faso is now using that land to feed its future. And where the post-independence elite once traded food sovereignty for international favor, Traoré has staked his reputation on complete agricultural independence. The implications go beyond economics. If this model spreads, it could recalibrate Africa's entire relationship with the West, not through confrontation, but through irrelevance. Because when a nation no longer needs food aid, it no longer needs to ask for permission. And that is revolutionary, not in the abstract, not in the distant future, but right now. In green fields where blood once soaked the soil, in markets that are slowly reopening, in schools that smell of fresh paint instead of dust. Burkina Faso is not shouting, it is not begging, it is showing. And the rest of Africa, especially its youth, is beginning to wonder, if they can do it, why can't we? Are we too dependent on foreign aid to imagine what self-reliance looks like, or are we just afraid to try? Let us know in the comments section what would happen if your country stopped waiting for help and started planting its future like Burkina Faso just did. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.